Welcome to the Burn Bag. My name is Andrew Gonawala, being joined by my co-hosts and co-producers Andrea Ochoa, Anna Haynes, and David Carpenter. Guys, how are you doing? It's the end of a long work day on Tuesday here in the DMV, and Andrea, you're in New York. But how are you all doing today?
Doing pretty well, Andre. I think, just waiting to get to the middle of the week, waiting until the week is over. It first snowed for the first time last night in New York, so it's a little bit cold here too. But it's not the nice powdery snow. It's like slushy city snow. It's not that nice.
I'm so jealous right now because I actually like cold weather. I don't like sunny, hot weather, and DC's hardly gotten a smattering of snow. Anna and David, I feel like y'all probably think differently from me.
No, I agree. I love snow so much. And we got those beautiful flurries for like an hour over the weekend. And I
That's
was just like
gorgeous.
pressing my nose to the glass of my windows, just taking it all in for the 1 hour of pretty snow that we get for like basically the whole winter.
Yeah, I know.
Yep.
I feel like in general, I haven't missed like the super cold winters that I grew up in, but um, definitely was glad we had at least a little bit of snow. I was a little disappointed before that I didn't get to see any pretty much the whole season.
Yeah, in all honesty, I dislike sunny skies and clear weather and all of that. I just love snow. And hopefully we'll get it next winter. But Andrea, I am jealous of you and all the New Yorkers. But we're not here to talk about the weather, as awkward as it always sounds. Uh, we're here to talk a bit about, what's happening in foreign policy and national security. We have a great episode that Anna and David were able to record last week. But first of all, what's been happening in the news? Well, President Biden did a sudden visit to Ukraine. He was in Kyiv meeting with President Zelensky. It was very much kept under wraps. Guys, what are your reactions to that news? Interesting visit. He was walking with his aviators with the President Zelensky as some air raid sirens were going off. But guys, reactions.
I think my initial reaction is how fascinating it is to try to at least comprehend the level of planning and organization that goes around trips like this. I think, it was something that at least it was unexpected for me in the news, but seeing that happen and just understanding what our strategic goals are in that region as of now, it wasn't really unexpected. I knew, at least at one point, Biden would want to display this kind of symbol of unrelenting support for Ukraine and the war efforts there, as well as doing a little bit of a tour in Eastern Europe and our NATO allies in that region as well. So again, just kind of a little bit, I guess, in awe of how much preparation I imagine going into it, but I think overall, an effective visit for the type of communication and strategy we want to put forth.
Yeah, certainly a very long train ride president had to take, I think, from Poland to Ukraine. And it's just crazy, how much of this was kept under wraps, how I think previous presidents, when they visited, for example, Iraq, Afghanistan, I know when President Bush visited, I believe, Iraq for Thanksgiving, that was very much kept under wraps. And so much security efforts go into that. But I think a fun fact, I think this is the first time a US president has visited sort of a battle zone, a war zone that wasn't under direct control by the US military, because, well, obviously the US military is not present in Ukraine. So I find that very interesting. Certainly, obviously, some communication probably went on with Russia earlier, to ensure that Biden would actually be able to step foot in Kyiv, obviously. But just such a interesting visit, and certainly a strong signal to allies and adversaries, for sure. David, do you have any thoughts?
Nothing that Andre didn't already mention. I just think, yeah, I wasn't surprised that he visited Ukraine. I think a lot of people were expecting, this big lead up to the tour in Eastern Europe that, or at least I was expecting that, that wouldn't be that surprising if he, made an appearance there, especially at least with Zelensky. But I think it was, yeah, interesting how much it was kept under wraps. And I did read that there was some prior communication with Russia, so it'd be interesting to know like what that communication looked like. and how they go about reporting his presence there, and what if there was any back and forth with that. But yeah, I think obviously an important symbolic moment for the president.
Yeah, certainly. And, obviously there's, I think, a little bit more political dissension about funding for Ukraine, funding in terms of military aid that the United States is providing to Ukraine. So I think that's going to be very interesting to see play out, over the days and months and weeks ahead, as there is more of a populist rejection, of the need to support Ukraine within the Republican Party, for example. But those conversations will be ongoing and will be interesting to observe. In other news, the Department of Energy gave a low confidence sort of a conclusion that a lab leak was the origin of COVID-19. So that's the DOE and the FBI believing that, whereas some other intelligence agencies and departments in the federal government believe that it was more of a zoonotic origin, sort of animal to human transfer of COVID. But what are y'all's reactions? Because it's interesting, right? Like, we're having different agencies sort of now give us different routes of COVID, but still a lot of uncertainty that's going around with the origins.
Yeah, something that's really struck me here is the way that this is reported, like so just like blatantly in the news cycle. I think it's really interesting that it's getting the level of attention that it is, given that a low confidence score, at least in my understanding, is the lowest score that you can get in analytic confidence. I think there's high confidence, moderate confidence, and then low confidence. So even if something's given high confidence, there's generally still a healthy dose of skepticism or assuming that that could be wrong. It's just that sources have been validated to the highest degree possible. Moderate confidence is kind of a shaky analytic conclusion. And then low confidence typically means we don't have confidence in those sources, or there's something that's, unreliable in that analysis. And so I think it's really interesting that this is dominating the news cycle with a vote of low confidence. And I think it just kind of begs the question of why this is coming out right now. There's a lot of reporting around China right now with the weather balloon, and it seems like this is shaping up to be a really hot political topic in the next elections. So I do just think it's interesting timing, especially given that this is a really low confidence estimation, and it doesn't really change either US or international bodies' interpretation of how COVID started.
Yeah, and it's curious, right? Because I feel like a lot of this coverage, certainly the coverage has been quite significant, right? Since this report by the Department of Energy came out. But I think it's significant that this is within the realm of possibility. For example, I feel like a lot of folks may say that this lab leak perspective may have been shut down, for example, in conversations in earlier months during the pandemic and so on. And there was a lot of sort of additional commentary, additional controversial commentary that paired up with the lab leak theory. But I think the fact that it is within the realm of possibility by the intelligence community itself is, I keep using the word interesting because of the lack of anything else to say, but it's certainly significant. But when we talk about the lab leak theory, this isn't like, oh, they were some evil scientists concocting some crazy virus in a lab, right? It's not like bio weaponry, but this is more sort of the situation where, they were doing research on, new coronaviruses. So they sort of set up perhaps these experimental viruses, and one of them got out somehow. But yeah, it's certainly going to be a big political hot button issue. Andrea, David, do you all have any comments, or Anna, do you have a response, I guess?
Yeah, I think just one other point to clarify is I think you make such a good point that this isn't something that was a nefarious plot behind the scenes, and that's not what we're saying. But the way that news headlines portray this, just because of limited words, I think could lead to some outrage against China in a way that I don't think is super productive. There's conventional wisdom that says a lot of viewers don't read past the headlines. There's the 80-20 rule, which I haven't found anything to corroborate this in terms of a study, but it is true to some extent that a lot of people will only read the headlines. And so those headlines leave a lot to be desired in terms of exploring what this low confidence assessment actually means. But yeah, I'll kick it over to Andrea and David too.
No, I mean, I think that was very well said, Anna. I think, it's also worth pointing out that not all of the intelligence agencies in the IC agree on, what is coming out regarding this topic on the origins of COVID. But I think it's very important to think critically about the news cycle, how we process news, and, the political events around us that lead us to taking in information in different ways. I'll just put it that way.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like, again, this being in the realm of possibility is certainly significant. But again, Anna, as you say, how the headlines are interpreted, when you see lab leak theory, quote unquote, confirmed by DOE, in the eyes, in the minds of many, that may lead them to make significant conclusions about, what the government is and isn't saying, and they never actually read the actual story. But again, that's been happening. Also, additionally, folks, I would want to point your attention to the conflicts occurring in Israel-Palestine and some of the violence over there. Please do take a look at that. Also, there's been a lot of controversy around the Nigerian elections, sort of an undercovered story, but still an important story. So take a look at that. But Anna and David, y'all had a great conversation last week. What's the subject of this week's episode?
So this week we talked to Cynthia Loertscher from the James Foley Legacy Foundation. And Andrea was talking earlier about how she was struck around the Biden visits to Ukraine, just the level of coordination that has to go into a visit like that. And I had a really similar reaction to what Cynthia was talking to us about in terms of bringing hostages or wrongfully detained people from abroad back home to the US. It was such a sprawling conversation. And I feel like my understanding of this issue was widely expanded. David, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, fully agree with everything you said, Anna. I think, I have some experience in the field of hostage affairs or whatever you want to call it, but agreed that I just think the conversation really took a lot of turns and level and expertise that I wasn't aware of beforehand. And just I think the knowledge I gained and the insights that I learned from the conversation were really interesting. And I think a lot of our viewers will think the same. So kick it off to our interview now. Today we are joined by Cynthia Loertscher. Cynthia is the Director of Research, Hostage Advocacy, and Government Affairs for the James W. Foley Legacy Foundation, a non-governmental organization dedicated to advocating for all Americans held hostage or wrongfully detained abroad. Cynthia is responsible for developing the Foundation's research efforts and authors the Foundation's annual Hostage and Wrongful Detainee Report, Bringing Americans Home, which she has authored for the past 4 years. Her other duties include building effective relationships across the U.S. government, third-party intermediaries, private hostage advocates, and other NGOs to successfully advocate for the return of Americans held hostage or wrongfully detained abroad. Prior to working for the Foundation, Cynthia was a contracted researcher at the Combating Terrorism Center at the United States Military Academy at West Point. There, she participated in a variety of research initiatives, all centered around counterterrorism efforts. Cynthia's background is also in the hard sciences, and she continues to collaborate with Miami University of Ohio, working on defense-related technologies. We're so excited to have her today. Cynthia, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So now just to get started, beyond, that the plethora of experiences you have in hostage affairs and the hard sciences and counterterrorism, I was wondering if you could just give a brief background from your own words of your career and kind of what brought you into the hostage affairs space.
Sure. To be honest, hostage affairs, getting into hostage affairs, it wasn't something that I had aspired to get into at first. At the time, I was working as a contracted researcher at the Combating Terrorism Center. And there was a project that focused on comparing trends in kidnapping of Westerners by jihadist groups against other militant groups and non-state actors. And that project was called Held Hostage. And that was a CTC report that was published about a little over a year after the brutal killings of Jim Foley and Steven Sotloff, Peter Kassig, and Kayla Mueller. And it was there at the CTC where I was able to help build the Held Hostage database. And honestly, it wasn't until probably a couple of years after that where the Foley Foundation approached me and I agreed to consult and help with some of their research efforts. And, things just developed slowly. And eventually I started leading their research efforts, and through that I engaged with a lot of hostage families and former hostages themselves. And the reason why I just mentioned the Held Hostage database is because I had looked at an enormous amount of data, raw data, and coded hundreds and hundreds of cases. And from an academic perspective, one that I had, I could really claim, hey, I'm familiar with hostage takings. But after engaging with families, I quickly realized I knew nothing. Just let me frame it this way. So in 2015, we'll talk about this probably a bit later, but there is the U.S. government conducted a review, which was led by the National Counterterrorism Center, the NCTC, and in the beginning of that review, they engaged with families as a whole, meaning that there was a large room, multiple families were in the same room together, and they're asking, family A, tell us about this experience. Family B, tell us. And it quickly, it was a very overwhelming process. And I know those individuals really were struck by how these families were impacted by hostage takings. And they quickly realized, hey, we need to individually address these cases one by one. In another instance, in this last spring, there's the ISIS trial. U.S. government was trying El Sheikh, one of the ISIS beetles that was responsible for the kidnapping and torture of many of our Americans that were killed in 2014 and 15. And I was sitting, I sat and listened to each of the survivors sharing their testimony and their experience. And it was overwhelming. It was very overwhelming. But I was accompanied by a terrorism and counterterrorism expert who spent decades, writing books on terrorism. He looked me in the eye and said, Cindy, I've been doing this for decades and I've never heard it this way. He too is impacted. So there's something to say about hostage takings, whether it be via non-state or by state actors. Each case is unique. Each case has its challenges and each case has its constraints. So I went from approaching hostage issues from more of an academic perspective to diving into the very, very deep end of the pool. And it's honestly become one of my greatest privileges of my life to serve and help these American citizens and their families who are held hostage or wrongfully detained abroad.
And now it sounds to me that you've taken this really rich background and academic experience and married that with these really poignant in-person experiences, working up close and personal with hostages and their families. And you're using that now to create a report series with the James W. Foley Legacy Foundation. I was wondering, could you tell us more about the role of that foundation, your work there, and the trajectory going forward?
Absolutely. So I'm sure there's many of your listeners that will remember Jim Foley. So Jim Foley, he was kidnapped Thanksgiving Day back in 2012 and was brutally killed by ISIS in August of 2014. And Jim's mother, Diane Foley, who, she instinctively knew that our government could and should do better for our fellow Americans who are taken hostage abroad. And it was probably about 3 weeks after Jim's death that she started the James Foley Legacy Foundation. And Diane really became one of the strongest voices for hostage issues and encouraged three administrations to do more to bring Americans home. And so our mission really was inspired by Jim's life's work. And since his passing, we've catalyzed action, produced timely, impactful research, advocated for policy changes that continue to change our hostage and wrongful detainee landscape that we see today. And, and last but not least, we have been able to advocate for Americans that are held hostage or wrongfully detained abroad. So, earlier I mentioned the NCTC review in 2015, and the Foley Foundation really wanted to continue those efforts to basically construct a non-governmental review to evaluate the hostage enterprise and family engagement. So this year, or I guess last year, in September of 22, we published our 4th annual report. And it's important to note that it's written from the perspective of hostage families, hostages themselves, as well as, their family representative or a hostage advocate. I do interview outgoing U.S. officials, but I keep that number very limited to less than 1% for the number of cases. So, really these reports are designed to identify whatever systemic gaps remain in our current hostage policy and be able to provide recommendations to just kind of plug those holes. Our goal is really to work constructively with the U.S. government. There are so many dedicated U.S. officials and people that care about these issues. And it's just so important to have a collaborative spirit about the work that we do and just continue to move forward as hostage and wrongful detainee issues continue to evolve.
You mentioned a little bit about working with the U.S. government and analyzing current U.S. hostage policy and giving recommendations for possible paths forward. And I was hoping you could just give our listeners a little bit of background on current U.S. hostage policy. So I know there's been a range of different policies in the past, but I think the main ones that stick today and are kind of emblematic of the general hostage strategy and policy of the U.S. government are, the PPD 30 and then the recent Levinson Act. And I was hoping, within both of those and just generally, you could give some background on what the current hostage policy landscape looks like.
Sure. Let me start with just a couple definitions at first. When I'm referring to hostage cases, I just want to be real specific. I'm excluding criminal cases in addition to barricade type incidents. So, which are the majority of hostage takings are criminally based. So we're talking like 5 to 10% of all hostage takings are the ones that that we're focusing on. These are characterized by U.S. nationals that are kidnapped by either a terrorist organization, a militant group, or pirates. And while they are smaller in number, they are very impactful. We saw the propaganda value of the ISIS killings back in 2014, and in the U.S. military response. So these are impactful cases. But I also, before I talk about policy, I do want to define a hostage versus wrongful detainee because it becomes critical when it comes to the policy. And so a hostage, again, as previously defined, again, follows along with individual kidnapped by a terrorist organization, militant group, pirate. And in addition, a wrongful detainee is an American who is held by a state actor instead. So they're detained, held for the same purposes, either to effect change in U.S. policy, force some form of concession, or try and force some type of swap, but they're held by foreign governments. So I just want to make that distinction at first. So, but to answer your question, going back to our current policy, which is PPD 30, as you mentioned, that's Presidential Policy Directive 30, that came out during the Obama administration in June of 2015, along with Executive Order 698, excuse me. And what that did was shift the previous policy, which was NSPD 12, which was an entirely classified document, and it did lack in family engagement components. Well, completely, actually. So PPD 30, what it did, it was an unclassified version of that to some extent. And what it also did was create the structures that we see today that are reflected in our U.S. government. For instance, we have the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell that is housed inside the FBI. It's an interagency, so it's not FBI owned, but so it's housed within the FBI. Over at the State Department, we have the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs. And within the National Security Council, we have a group called the Hostage Response Group. And that's chaired by a special presidential, a special assistant to the president, senior director for counterterrorism over within the NSC there. So we also, outside of those main structures, we do have positions that were created as well. We have a family engagement coordinator over at the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell, and also an intelligence arm, somebody that's specifically mandated to help declassify information for families so they can get timely information when necessary. So those are the structures that we see in place today since 2015. And, when it comes to policy, so as I mentioned, we have hostages and wrongful detainees. PPD 30 discussed hostage issues, individuals, again, held by terrorist organizations, etc. When it came to wrongful detainees, they weren't mentioned. There's a slight discussion under the creation of the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs. I'll call him SPIHA, that's what we call him. So within the SPIHA's office, they can take on those cases, but that's it. But there's no structures built behind that. So it's really critical why we continue to look at these cases and just watch the hostage and wrongful detainee landscape as they evolve, because they really do impact our policies and our national security.
Thank you so much for providing the clarity around the different terms and policies around hostage and wrongful detainee cases. I know, as someone coming from the outside of this topic, I didn't know the distinction there. And I think a lot of our listeners will agree. Some of the only times that this comes up to the general public is when we encounter different trends in hostage cases in the news. So that might be journalists being detained, or really big high profile cases, but we don't know the overall trends and the historic background. So I was wondering if you could just give us a primer on what are the trends throughout maybe the past decade or 2 decades in hostage cases, and how are those changing and evolving right now?
That's an excellent question. Actually, in our September 22 Bringing Americans Home report, the first half of that report actually looked at the landscape of hostage cases versus wrongful detainee cases from 2001 to 2022. So the data stopped in August of 22 due to publication. But excellent question. When it comes to trends, hostage cases by non-state actors overall have been cyclical. And while currently there are fewer cases in number, the durations of the kidnapping of Americans has increased, and we can quantify that in this last decade. The length of captivity has increased by 60%. Basically, where terrorist groups expand, we see hostage taking tends to follow that. And and it's a concern, really, because with recent Western withdrawals, it creates these type of opportunities. Specifically, we're seeing this in Africa, where we're still seeing a lot of these hostage takings. But when it comes to wrongful detainees, the numbers are staggering. So just for example, the number of countries, back in 2001 that were holding wrongfully detaining Americans were 2 countries, China and Iran. Now, in this previous decade, we've had up to 19 countries that are wrongfully detaining Americans. So when we looked at the incident increase, so from the previous decade to this past decade, the number of incidents of Americans get wrongfully detained has increased by 175%. Now, so if you have these incidents, so you're having more Americans that are detained, well, they're also continuing to be held longer. While we do have releases, which are great, there's still a cumulative growth of the number of Americans who continue to be held year after year. And that number from this past decade to the current decade is increased by 580%. percent increase for the number of Americans who continue to be held. And, today, we track the number of known cases, public cases, if you will, of Americans that are currently held hostage or wrongfully detained. So those in combinations over 60 Americans. And the average length of detainment we're saying is over 4.5 years. And, and we looked at that in the previous decade, we looked at those numbers again. And the majority of Americans that were held, they were held for less than a year. And this current decade, it's flipped. The majority of Americans who continue to be held are over 4.5 years.
Well, that's really interesting. And also coming from someone who has a little bit of background in this issue, I wasn't aware of that recent change in the duration of hostage cases. I guess just following up on that, I was curious if you could give some insight, whatever background you have, or personally what you think of the situation. If you could explain why you think that is that hostage cases are tending to have longer durations in recent years, or if that's just a general policy, or if there's any difference we see between state and non-state actors on that issue. Really, whatever you could share on that would be really interesting.
Sure. We'll start with wrongful detentions. And so the majority of these cases, we got to look, you have to, you can't look at it overall, right? You need to look by country. And the majority of countries that are holding Americans are China, Iran, Russia, Venezuela, Syria. So we look at our relationship with those countries, right? So we've had a decrease in the number of Americans held in North Korea, actually. But looking at the countries that are predominantly wrongfully detaining Americans, we're in this gray space, right? So it's a way to hold Americans to, again, their tactic is been the same all along. It's to try and force some form of concession or to affect some sort of change in U.S. policy, very similar to hostage taking. The difference is we know where they are. However, the stakes are just as high. And these poor innocent Americans just become these geopolitical pawns, getting pushed in between our U.S. policy and our relations with some of these countries. And it's an opportunity to be able to just really kind of poke at the United States and really try and, impact, our priorities. So it's such an important issue. And as I mentioned before, we looked at, while we're talking about a limited, like with just hostage cases, a limited number, compared to the entire scope of, criminal hostage taking. These are impactful cases, and just look how we've responded. So
I know you've said a few times throughout this interview already that every single case is so unique. It depends on who's involved. It depends on where they are. But I was wondering if you could just give us a look at what is the U.S. government's response when a hostage or wrongful detainee case is identified? What are those first steps, or what groups and people are mobilized into action?
That's a great question. So when a hostage situation arises, the early stages are most critical. First 24 hours, first 48 hours, first 2 weeks, very, very, very important. And being able to gather intelligence and corroborating that intelligence is so important, to be able to make decisions based off of the intelligence that you're able to gather. Because hostage rescue operations, they're extremely risky. There's so much data on that, and the risks to the force and the risks to the forces and the risks to the hostage are great. But to mitigate that, you need good intelligence. And honestly, with in some of these areas, with the reduction of our RCT footprint, it makes gathering that intelligence all the more challenging, and the ability to conduct these hostage rescue operations. So, but you can shift, it doesn't render us useless. You just have to shift, and this is where relationships with our partners come into play, our protecting powers. But all that depends, again, where an American is currently held hostage. But also, this is why we have our hostage recovery fusion cell, which again this was created in 2015. So I mentioned earlier that the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell, called the HRFC, is housed inside the FBI. It's essentially the U.S. government's dedicated interagency coordinating body at the operational level for the recovery of U.S. nationals that are all held hostage abroad. The cell is really critical because they identify and make recommendations for when it comes to hostage recovery options and strategies, and that goes to the president. However, I mentioned that hostage response group in the National Security Council, so it goes through the hostage response group and goes up to the president. In addition, the cell is really important because they're supposed to coordinate their efforts with other departments and agencies to make sure all the information is current and accurate. In addition to what they're supposed to do is to also, continue to track these hostage cases and continue to report through the HRG up to the president. But overall, the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell, they're the main conduit within the U.S. government that engages with the executive branch, all the other departments and agencies. And at the same time, they're interfacing with the hostage families themselves. So they have a really interesting role. And it's so important because these families, they're super savvy, and it's great to make sure that we're getting all of that information from the families as well, because every last bit helps. You'd be amazed at some of these relationships that these families have, and sometimes it cracks the case. I've seen it, and not to go into it, but it happens. So it's really an incredible and dynamic organization. And I'd like to see the cell continue to grow and adapt as hostage and detainee issues evolve.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really important issue, and we'll go a little more into the U.S. government's interaction with hostage advocates and their families in a second. But I just wanted to go back to one point you mentioned briefly, which is, the U.S. government's interaction with protecting powers in other countries where there are wrongful detainees or hostage cases, perhaps. And I was hoping you could expand a little bit on the role that diplomacy plays in bringing Americans home, and what those relationships look like, how they shift in the event of a hostage case, and just any insight you can give there.
That is so important. Diplomacy is absolutely critical in all of these cases, hostage and wrongful detainee cases. Absolute critical role in bringing Americans home. And this is, going back to the policy, we have that special presidential envoy for hostage affairs, or SPIHA. That position was created to lead these diplomatic engagements on hostage policy, as well as coordinate all the diplomatic engagements in support of hostage recovery efforts. But it's in coordination with the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell. But to be honest, it's like the PPD 30 says one thing, but in reality, we're seeing a dual relationship. The cell it's focused on hostage cases, and then the SPIHA's office is focused on these wrongful detention cases, which makes sense. However, we need a lot of coordination between these two organizations to be able to bring these Americans home. But yes, diplomacy is critical. And it's great that we have the special presidential envoy that we currently have, Roger Carsons. He's absolutely incredible, and works directly with these families, is coming up with a lot of recovery strategies, and is briefing again. And they're able to brief these recovery options through the hostage response group to get up to the president. But it would be really great to see more coordination. Getting up to POTUS to be able to bring these Americans home, because these are high-level decisions that have to be made. The legwork is being done, and that's absolutely critical and essential. But the missing element, and that is so important for these families, because look, we have cases that are, like I said, on average 4.5 years. One of our cases is over 20 years. And we have so many Americans, so many families that are being impacted. And the longer these Americans are continuing to be held, we need to have decisive action at the POTUS level. We absolutely do. So it's so important that we are able to, we have these structures in place. They're functioning well. But what we need to do is continue to elevate and prioritize these hostage and wrongful detainee cases so that we know that these decisions are being had at the president's desk. And, one of the positions that we're advocating for is the creation of a deputy assistant to the president, to be able to sit on the regional side. Like I said, we had that hostage response group that's chaired by the SAP CT, senior director for CT. But on the regional side, we need at the deputy level to be able to prioritize, because these issues, right? Like, remember, the majority of our cases, we're dealing with Iran, we're dealing with China, we're dealing with Venezuela and Russia and Syria. These are complicated matters. So it's not to derail, but it's to be included, to make sure that we have somebody that's eyes laser focused on wrongful detainee issues, that can be able to see what's being pushed through the NSC, so to be able to identify potential opportunity, to be able to elevate or be able to negotiate to get an American out. It's so important that we continue that, to increase the prioritization within the White House, so we know that the president is seeing these cases, so we can make decisive decisions. I'll take my advocacy hat off here. I know I'm a researcher, but but the hostage advocacy work, it gets me fired up sometimes. So
I imagine it would be hard to differentiate between the academic and the advocate side of your role. They're just so closely intertwined. I'm wondering, with all this talk of national apparatuses and then diplomacy between countries, is there anything that international organizations like the UN or some other apparatus does or could do to come alongside the US government or individual governments and help out in these cases?
That's so important. This comes down to accountability and deterrence, right? Which is so important, because these are terrible, situations where, I understand, like, these are difficult decisions that the president has to make. Absolutely, 100%. Nobody's going to argue that. So, working with Canada, for example, is leading a coalition that really is getting off the ground. It's a multilateral group working with the UK, the United States, I believe Australia as well. And, how are we going to respond to, foreign governments that are wrongfully detaining our citizens? This isn't just happening in the United States. This is happening all over. And going back to, we have the International Convention Against the Taking of Hostages, right? So that was a UN driven agreement back in '79. Let's look at how we should respond to wrongful detentions. Should it be bilateral response, which is easier because you're just, you're working. It's important to work with, your Five Eyes would be a great example if you want to build out larger to do multilateral. Because remember, you need to be able to, all the countries that are on the support, you have to be in agreement, right? So you don't want to create, because these are tough decisions. These get right into each of the country's national security, right, decision making process. So it's good to, if you're going to do a multilateral response, work closely with your allies and your allied nations who are bilateral, but there needs to be something that is holding these foreign governments accountable for taking our innocent Americans and holding them hostage.
Yeah, definitely. Agree with that, and understand the difficulties of, international coalitions when you have different ideas and different goals, and especially in the case of, large organizations like the UN, where the group that might be holding the wrongful detainee is also involved in any negotiation. So I think that's a really interesting point, and thank you for the insight. Now to shift the conversation a little bit into more of the work that you do day to day and the work of the James W. Foley Legacy Foundation, I was wondering if you could give some insight into what the U.S. government's approach is to engaging hostage advocates, whether that be families, friends, loved ones, even the media, perhaps. And so what that engagement looks like, and maybe some background into when that engagement started, how it's evolved with recent policies, and the and different administrations, and just any background you can share with that.
Sure. So again, right. So out of PPD 30 was that family engagement component. So from the hostage situation, from a hostage perspective, remember, so the cell is the one that's taking on hostage cases, and the SFIHA's office is taking on these wrongful detention cases. We have a family engagement coordinator. So there is a family engagement component to work closely with these families. And, through the Levinson Act, the Robert Levinson Act, that was codified, essentially codified PPD 30 back in December of 2020. That was an incredible law that was passed, and not only did it codify the structures put in place from PPD 30, it also included 11 different criteria that defines what this wrongful detention is, right? So we have 11 different criteria, and it's really challenging for some of these families to get that designation. It's so important because it impacts everything. So if you don't have a classification of a wrongful detention, your case is going to sit in consular affairs, which is, it's not a bad thing. It's just consular affairs, their job isn't to get Americans out of prison. And, their job is to do wellness checks to make sure, legal process is going on okay, those sorts of things. But when it comes to wrongful detentions, which is less than 1% of the number of Americans that are detained abroad, it's so important that we have this SFIHA engagement, because they're looking at this case as a hostage case. Like, how do we get this American out? How do we advocate? How do we utilize all of our resources? How do we engage, right? Which is so important. Not only is that important to get them out, but it's also having that wrongful detention criteria is critical. So think about when the American comes home, they were just swiped off the street, most of them. They've been held for years. They haven't paid their taxes. They defaulted on loans. All sorts of fines have just kind of occurred over time, and on paper they were detained, right? So you can't send that to the credit company. You can't send that to the IRS. Oh, this person was detained. They're not going to care. But if you're wrongfully detained, you're treated as a hostage. And we currently have legislation in place where there is a hostage tax, wrongful detainee tax. So the IRS will reimburse the individual if they pay these fines, and so forth. So important. And so it's so great to see that growth there. But it all comes back down to this wrongful detention determination. So one of the biggest challenges is getting these cases out of consular affairs, because we can have 3,000 to 5,000 Americans detained abroad, and it's not illegal to detain American. So it's so important to be able to have these eyes on these cases and to train our consular officers, which currently is happening. They've readjusted some things to be able to be able to spot a wrongful detention. And any American that's detained in some of these countries. Now our State Department has given a D designation to some countries where the potential for wrongful detention can occur. So before you travel, look in these countries that you're going to. Does it have that D? It's so important because it's going to have an impact. But when it comes to the U.S. government's approach to engaging hostage advocates, I believe is one of the things you asked. It's usually the other way around. I would say that the hostage advocates engage with the U.S. government. And there's several reasons for that. I mean, let's just start with one. So we have our Privacy Act, right, which is important, and that's ingrained into U.S. law for sure. But what you can do when you're held overseas, there is a Privacy Act waiver. We call it the PAW, and it's so important for that to be signed. And it's so important for any American that's wrongfully detained that they understand what that document is, because they can go and check off all these boxes. Yes, saying that the U.S. government has permission to talk to a hostage advocate, talk to the family, talk to Congress, to be able to discuss this case, because families are desperate. They're in communication with their loved one. It's not a mystery it's rarely a mystery of like, oh, where has my loved one been in the last couple of weeks? It's some Americans were picked up on the phone talking to their loved ones. So American families, they know what's happening. And, with these reports, I mean, I've conducted over, on individual interviews, over 250 some interviews with families, and I haven't come across a single person or a single former hostage or wrongful detainee that says, man, I wish my family didn't have information. So it's so important to have that PAW signed. And, we're also seeing challenges in getting that signed, not in every country, but where there is a U.S. consulate, sometimes we're seeing a delay in having a U.S. consular officer go in and be able to physically hand the PAW over to the American, which delays communication. I mean, we've seen, weeks, months go by, and the U.S. government cannot talk to family members about what's going on. So there's a lot of challenges there. So one of the recommendations that we've proposed is, not to change the Privacy Act, or just to, but when there's a wrongful detention suspected by a U.S. official, have another U.S. official come along with that consular officer and act as a witness. So they can verbally say, hey, this is the Privacy Act waiver. Do you agree to X, Y, Z, or no? And that way you're also making sure that the American knows that that it's the U.S. government that's asking this. Sometimes there's confusion. Sometimes nobody's speaking English, so they're afraid to sign anything. So there's lots of challenges there. So that's one of the recommendations we've had, just to make to amendment for in case of a wrongful detention, or suspected one, I should say.
You've started touching on this topic already, but I'd love to dig in a little bit more. It sounds like the families and friends being advocates go through and pull off these really intense feats of just connecting with the right resources, doing everything in their power to bring their loved ones home. What sort of support is available to them, be that financial support, legal support from the U.S. government, or even reintegration support once their loved one comes home?
You touched on something. I want to go back to what you're saying, but it's like these families, when this happens, they don't know that these structures are even in place. So one of the first things they're going to do is reach out to their representative or their senators, somebody, right? Or they're calling the State Department. I mean, we've seen improvement there, but it's, these families, not that the U.S. government is saying, hey, we're going to worry about this case later. These are complicated and complex issues where your families are constantly under pressure of trying to prioritize their case, where you're essentially standing on the desks of all these U.S. officials, politely, kindly encouraging to continue to prioritize their case. I mean, like, there's a number of Americans that are wrongfully detained. There's a number of national security issues. So it's an enormous challenge. And you have to remember, these families are super distraught. I mean, their loved ones, I mean, it's not as simple. Prisons overseas are not pleasant, especially in some of these countries. Like, Americans are being tortured. And it's very difficult. And I mean, these families are desperate and looking for any help. But essentially what they have to do is launch a campaign. They have to. So that you have to garner support. You have to grow in numbers to be able to elevate the issue and get attention. Not every family member is going to be very loud about it. Some are very quiet, and sometimes it's actually beneficial to stay super quiet about it. The families typically get louder when they're trying to get the attention of the U.S. government. But what's critical for these families is that they're connected. You need to be connected to that legislative side. You need to be in contact with your representative and your senators. Ask for briefings. Ask for the State Department, provide a brief to my representatives and brief them on what's going on, because a lot of this stuff is classified, and it takes time to declassify some of this information. And in addition to that, these families are working with a lot of NGOs. There's the Foley Foundation, of course. There's Hostage US. that helps families as they're walking along, helping try to figure out some of these financial issues, getting power of attorneys. I can't even imagine, is very difficult. And there's other medical issues that develop. A lot of mental health supports required for these families. But in addition, these families are, they're getting presence on Twitter. They're getting there's a Bring Our Family Home campaign, which is a lovely campaign where all these families that have current cases have come together. They have a singular message. They just want for POTUS to utilize all tools necessary to bring their loved ones home. That's a message every family can get behind. That's been so helpful. But they're trying to get attention. They're trying to garner media's attention to elevate this case, to be able to continue to prioritize and for high level decisions to be made at the POTUS level. But yeah, I wanted to say that first. But your other question, please remind me. I'm sorry.
Are there any formal support mechanisms available to the families? Like, is there
right.
an
Critical.
office that helps provide that, social, legal,
critical. Thank you. Yes. So this is what's crazy, right? So you have your hostage cases that will sit over at the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell. And those families are able to access funds from the Victims of Crime Act, call it VOCA, right? So that supports some level of travel for families to come to Washington, D.C., which is absolutely critical, as I explained before, to be able to continue to, quote unquote, stand on the desks and ask for, where are we in this case? Please be transparent. Want to know the progress. So there's that. Wrongful detainees have absolutely nothing. There is no funding. There's no line of funding for the cell itself, or the SFIHA's office, so that's that. If there's a critical issue in the hostage and wrongful detainee space, obviously, recovery and facilitating releases are number one, sure, bringing Americans home. But it's that is the fact that there's no funds to support travel expenses for wrongful detainee families, support for hostage or wrongful detainee flights home, and the medical treatment that they receive on that flight. I will say, so in case somebody's listening, push Congress so they can authorize and appropriate funds. But the SFIHA's office has done a tremendous job finding funds where they can to help to make sure Americans currently are not going to be held responsible for their flight home. And sometimes these are military flights, and you have a lot of personnel on the flight. So, these bills can be pretty large. In addition, there's, we need support for returning hostages and wrongful detainees for just essential needs that arise upon recovery, clean clothes. These returned hostages, it's difficult to find a job. And, and they need insurance, right? You can't, and they need support, but you need a job to be able to get the insurance for everything else to follow after that. Well, it's enormously challenging. I do mention in the report, the Bringing Americans Home 22 report, an instance where, an American that did come home they were really, so this report is all anonymous. I don't share anybody that's participated. And, but they were real adamant. They wanted their story shared. And, so they were held underground. And, upon entering the cell, they noticed a stack of, it's just black trash bags. And they couldn't see what was in the trash bags, but they knew exactly what was in there. And these were deceased remains of former individuals that were held, and they were purposely kept in the cell. And these bags continued to pile up, and they wouldn't remove them. and they would pile up to the ceiling. They would take them out, start the process again, and this would be repeated over and over. And that's, I mean, I'm not even going to get into the physical torture that this individual experienced. But, you know, spending years in an environment, this is just one of many cases, years in an environment like that is so traumatic. And how do you just come home? I will say, I have noticed that individuals that have come home, that have strong families and a support system, seem to do a little bit better. But then there's some families that don't have that family support, and they're either homeless, they can't get a job, they can't maintain a job. And so there's just such a need. There's such a need. And, you know, the Foley Foundation helps, Hostage US helps. There are so many needs that for some of these returned hostages. But, you know, just even financial support while somebody is being held, that's something that's not, I mean, we provide support for, you know, for Americans that are held. We don't know for sure if they receive it, but just for basic needs like food and water. These families are responsible for that. So they have people on the ground where their loved ones are held. I mean, they're desperate. They are desperate they're at the mercy of anybody in this foreign country. And they hope that they are taking the money and doing what they're supposed to do with it. But I will say a lot of these families have been extorted at time after time. So it just even being able to identify, you know, how do we identify an organization? You can't say that. It's in some of these areas, it's very difficult. But, you know, is there a way to identify whether or not these materials are being used? And I do want to say, this is important. So if you have if there is a consulate, right, and a U.S. official comes in, you have to know that they're going to all of a sudden put a mattress or something in there, clean a sheet, or all of this stuff. Like, that's not the, you know, or make sure that they come, that the bruises are gone. They'll wait. There'll be a suspension, I mean, a week or two where a U.S. official can't go in. So you got to keep in mind that that they're using these Americans and punishing America through them.
Appreciate the insight you gave there. I think that raises a lot of really interesting questions and concerns about how we need to adjust our hostage policy, and some recommendations, I think, too, for how we can improve it and make sure that we have policies and the right resources in place to bring Americans home faster, and make sure that those that are held abroad are being treated as best as possible in these, you know, difficult situations. Just to shift it a little bit as we get closer to the end, I think you mentioned, you know, the need to advocate for yourself, especially, you know, hostage advocates in that sense, and the need for better hostage advocacy policies, including, you know, advocating your congressperson and pushing for certain legislation yourself, or through, you know, media campaigns and building publicity around specific cases. And I think we'd all like to see this issue as non-political, but I was curious if you see this as an area of bipartisanship, and if you've noticed any particular pushback to any bills or policies around hostage policy, or if you think that this is really an area where both sides can come together to promote positive change.
Well, actually, this is it's so important because it is a bipartisan issue, and we see that reflected in our government, which is critical. We have on the House side, we have a fairly newly formed hostage and wrongful detainee task force, which has been important. But we have on the Senate side, we have a really, really strongly engaged Foreign Relations Committee that has been critical in keeping our current policy. Well, as I mentioned before, we have the Robert Levinson Hostage Recovery and Hostage Taking Accountability Act, which codified PBD 30 in December of 2020. But there have been amendments in the NDAA this past year, and we're continuing to push to be able to hopefully get some funds appropriated to be able to fund. But overall, it's been very encouraging to see, because we see both sides of the aisle who care about this issue. Can we use more champions for hostage issues? Yes, always. Because when it's time to continue to grow the policy, we need all the support as possible. But it's also it's also so important, right? And depending who is Democrat that's in the Oval Office or Republican, we don't see often anybody kind of really poking at the administration based off of whatever the current policy is. There was initially in the beginning, but there was a quick shift, and that required just engagement on the Hill, talking about these issues. Yes, we're going to see U.S. officials interacting with folks that we may not like in the United States. But why is that so important? We have to have these discussions. We must be at the same table so we can talk and have our SFIHA along with because there's nobody better that's going to be able to identify an opportunity to use diplomacy to be able to get our Americans home and be able to bring that information back so it gets through our hostage response group and up to POTUS. So it's so important that other members on the Hill, that they recognize, like, oh, we have our SFIHA engaging. Okay, let's deconflict this. Let's not look at this as this doesn't equal the United States is now engaging in talks, and we have our foreign policy says XYZ, this shouldn't be happening. But to just kind of step back and let our SFIHA do its job and get our Americans home. So it's been very encouraging, actually, which we hope continues for sure.
I think we have time for one final question. And so the last one that we have prepared to ask you is, what are the main challenges you see coming down the line for U.S. hostage policy? But I mean, maybe to reframe that and carry on this slightly optimistic note that we're on, what are the next big opportunities that you see, the next big achievement that you're striving toward under your advocate hat in making U.S. policy more responsive to the needs of hostages and their families as well? Sure.
Again, the funding is absolutely critical, and that is something that we're in full speed on to be able to get these families. I mean, their retirements are depleted. The entire family, like the brothers, the sisters, not just parents or spouses. The entire family, they deplete all of their funds, and and the cases are still going. So funding is a huge priority. Another, like I said, so PPD 30, remember, it didn't touch on wrongful detainees like it did with hostages, even though we do consider wrongful detainees held hostage by foreign governments. But just to use the correct nomenclature and how the U.S. government responds, just to stay on track there, to call for another comprehensive review, to look at how is the cell functioning? The hostage recovery fusion cell, for instance, is supposed to have a rotating director from different departments and agencies. We haven't seen that yet. And does that, the question is, does that have an impact? It's an organization held within the FBI. Is the cell in the right place? Does it need to be in a more neutral location? These are questions that we should be asking. In addition, as I mentioned before, the Deputy Assistant to the President on the regional side within the National Security Council that can have an eye out for these cases and elevate these cases to a National Security Advisor and above when necessary. And in addition, the PAW agreement, that would be so helpful for some of these families for next steps. Those are just to name a few of priorities that we should be focusing on this year. But really, it would be encouraging to see, again, as I mentioned before, to see a comprehensive review, to look at how the enterprise is doing. And again, these structures have been great. When I first started working for the Foley Foundation, I interviewed a lot and spent a lot of time with a lot of the families pre-PPD 30. And the experience that these families, I mean, they essentially, their loved ones were taken hostage and the captors are calling their house and, extorting these families for money, torturing their loved ones while they're, in the middle of the call. So these families are desperate. And at the same time, they were told they couldn't negotiate, they couldn't provide, and they couldn't pay a ransom. And their arms were just literally, they too were held hostage in a sense. Their arms were behind their backs. So we've seen a drastic improvement. And I'm saying that just by making a comparison of the families where their loved ones were held hostage pre-PPD 30, so pre-June of 2015 to post. And, and that's not to minimize current family situations today. It's all difficult. It's horrendous. But there are structures in place, which is good. So we're not calling to disrupt that. And it's so important that PPD 30, which I think was so important compared to the previous policy, NSPD 12, which is entirely classified. You had U.S. officials that, this was a read-only document, and they didn't know what they could share with families. So they too it was unclear. So PPD 30 is mostly an unclassified document. The annex and appendix that is classified, which is important, and there's that family engagement component. So let's keep that. Let's build upon what has been successful. Let's again, like our reports do. Let's identify where the gaps are. Let's work constructively, and how do we build upon the current structures that we see in place that match the data that we're seeing with all these Americans. I mean, of the ones that are currently detained, over 90% are wrongful detainees versus Americans held hostage by terrorist organizations today.
Great. Well, thank you again. That's all the questions we have for today. And I just want to reiterate that I definitely learned a lot about where we are today and our support to hostages and wrongful detainees and their advocates, and what we can do moving forward to hopefully improve our responsiveness to hostage advocates and to just bring Americans home in general. And I'm sure our viewers have learned a lot too. Again, yeah, this is a really interesting and important topic that I don't think gets talked about enough. So again, just want to thank you so much for your time and for providing all of your important insight and knowledge into this issue.
Well, thank you. We thank you from the Foley Foundation for highlighting this. Really, obviously, we're passionate about this topic. There's so much more that needs to be done, and we're appreciative of your audience for taking the time to listen today. So thank you all.
That was our interview with Cynthia Loertscher. I know for me, coming into this interview with very little background other than the research I had done for this interview, I thought it was so fascinating. My policy nerd side was definitely very happy as we were talking about the interplay between all the different government agencies and just learning how we can improve those processes. And Cynthia just had so much to share. I feel like she was an absolute wealth of knowledge. So David, I know you have somewhat of a background in learning about this type of policy and working on these issues. So I was wondering, what is something that you learned from this conversation? What was your biggest takeaway?
Yeah, thanks for that. And yeah, agreed. I think even with, a background on this issue a little bit, compared to the amount of knowledge that Cynthia has on this issue. And I think she brought up a lot of really interesting points that I think this is a really interesting topic that affects a lot of people, even in ways that we don't necessarily see on the media a lot. So I was really happy to hear all of her thoughts on, like you said, government interactions with different agencies, hostage advocacy in general, and just the whole gamut of everything that goes into hostage affairs. I think even, with my background, something that I learned that I wasn't aware of was just the point on the duration of hostage cases and wrongful detainee cases in recent years. I wasn't aware that, even though the rate of hostage cases is declining in terms of, total number of cases, that the length has kind of dramatically increased in recent years. So that was an interesting point that I wasn't aware of, and I think creates some interesting problems for how to deal with these cases. I think it's great that the number of cases is decreasing, but trying to figure out how best to bring someone home who's been somewhere for multiple years at a time, I think gets increasingly hard. And like Cynthia mentioned, those first 24 to 48 hours being the most important. I think it presents a unique set of issues. So that was what I learned, at least that I wasn't aware of. I think my knowledge expanded a lot on a lot of different issues that I had a little bit of background on, but haven't touched on in a few years maybe. So, but yeah, overall, I think a really interesting conversation. Now I feel like there's a lot that I need to look into and research that I wasn't aware of that I'm interested in now. So, yeah, really insightful.
I totally agree. I know that there's actually a documentary about the founding story of the James Foley Foundation. I think I'm going to have to go watch that now after this interview. Maybe some of our listeners will as well. So that's all for the burn bag today, and we hope to have you all back here next time. Thanks for listening.